Welcome to the wonderful Camden Public Library for Camden Conference community event. I'm Nick Mills. I am on the board of directors of the Camden Conference. And I just wondered, we have a full house tonight. Are you here for the same reason that I am? This is warmer than your house. Many thanks to Julia Sagerser and the library staff for hosting this event, as they have hosted many a Camden Conference community event. Camden Conference is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and almost totally volunteer educational organization. Our mission is to offer the community informed discourse on matters of global concern. And we have a wonderful time doing that, as you could see in the video. We have three principal components. One of them is what you're experiencing tonight, a Camden Conference community event. Local experts, local libraries, and I think we have, 17 participating libraries now, to share with the community the experts' knowledge on topics related to our upcoming February conference. The second leg of the tripod is Camden Conference in the classroom, the educational component. We involve high school and college and university students who enroll in special courses created by their professors and teachers related to the upcoming conference, and then they attend the conference in February as our guests. I think we have 15 participating high schools now and 6 colleges and universities. And of course, the third leg of the tripod is the big show, the Camden Conference in February, single issue, topic of global interest, expert speakers from all over the world. And the conference is held in the beautiful Camden Opera House, just a short walk from here, and live streamed to the Strand Theatre in Rockland and the Lunt Auditorium in Falmouth, and to home computers around the world. As you could probably tell from that little video, being there is half the pleasure. It's a community experience, interactive experience with the community. Any members of the Camden Conference here? I know a few. Oh, good. Anybody got a ticket yet? Good. You're lucky, because I think the Opera House is sold out, practically. A few seats left. All right. But there are seats left at the Strand Theatre and the Lunt Auditorium. The conference topics are selected more than a year in advance. We were talking about this earlier, giving us ample time to recruit speakers and plan logistics. And the topic for the February 2026 is the Middle East, exploration of the power, politics, and major players. And we have a terrific lineup of speakers. And this year, Public Radio's Meghna Chakrabarti is going to be making her debut as the Camden Conference moderator. So that brings us to this evening's speaker, Professor Robert Morrison, whose topic I find really fascinating: merchants of knowledge, intellectual exchange in the Ottoman Empire and Renaissance Europe. That's the topic, and also the title of his book. The merchants in the title were Jewish scholars who, it seems, were uniquely qualified to be an east-west bridge, as Professor Morrison will explain. Robert Morrison is the George Lincoln Schofield Jr. Professor of Religion and Middle Eastern and North African Studies at Bowdoin. His research has focused on the role of science in Islamic and Jewish texts, as well as in the history of Islamic science, and is also, as mentioned, the author of Merchants of Knowledge, Intellectual Exchange in the Ottoman Empire and Renaissance Europe. Professor Morrison.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. If I talk like this, are people able to hear me? I'm more confident in my voice than my ability to hold a mic. Okay, well, and we can change it up if need be. Okay, great. I'm grateful to V. Sheehan. No, okay. And the members of the Camden Conference for inviting me to be with you this evening. Also for the Maine Humanities Council for bringing me in. I'd also like to thank Julia Sagerser for handling a surprising number of practical details and for keeping me on task, which is something. Okay. All right. I'm here to speak about my recent book, Merchants of Knowledge, on intellectual exchange in the Eastern Mediterranean between 1450 and 1550. Some background in the history of Islam and in science and Islamic societies, I hope will help us understand more about why this project is compelling, at least to me. All right. So Islam gets going in the 7th century of the Common Era. All the dates are Common Era, which is a nicer way of saying AD. All right. The Prophet Muhammad, who is the most important prophet, that's with a PH, for Islam, died in 632. And the Quran, Islam's foundational text, was composed by 700. During the 700s, as the Islamic Empire expanded, particularly after Muhammad's death, secretaries and ministers skilled up by tapping the scientific cultures of the conquered Byzantine and Sasanian Empire. The Sasanian Empire was the last pre-Islamic empire in Persia. Knowledge was often, but not always, exchanged through translation. With this map here, what you see is you see a map of most of the Islamic Empire at the time of Harun al-Rashid, who's the famous caliph or leader from the Arabian Nights. So I figure a name that might land. It's big. It's getting big. And you can see that the Muslims have invaded and taken over a lot of the Byzantine Empire, as well as what used to be the Sasanian Empire. And both of those empires had significant scientific heritages. Because of this exchange that's starting in the 700s, science in Islamic societies was really flourishing by the 800s. By the end of the 10th century, things were so good that European scholars were traveling to Iberia, which is Spain avant la lettre, like it's Spain before it became Spain, to learn. There was a burst of translations, in fact, from Arabic into Latin in the 12th century, and those translations kept going into the 13th century. Up until actually the middle of the 20th century, historians presumed the translations petered out because there was nothing left to translate. There was a misconception that religious opposition ended science in Islamic societies in like the 12th century, really. Yeah. But historians began to change their tune in the 1980s when research on science in Islamic societies from the 14th century onward began to proliferate. And the key for this presentation, which is somewhat cut off, but that's okay, is that there were important scientific theories from Islamic societies from the 14th century and from the 15th century that were never translated into Latin, but were known in Europe. So that's sort of like hopefully the takeaway from this brief history of science so far. All right. I looked at the lineup for the upcoming conference in February of 2026, and I appreciate Nick Mills's kind words about my book. However, I did notice that the speakers are knowledgeable mostly about the modern Middle East. It's a good thing to have a conference on. And so here's why my historical project matters for people who are more interested in the modern Middle East. First, I'll give you two big reasons, right? Just to get going. The European Renaissance, which is so important, it's so foundational for the self-image of the West. The European Renaissance begins during the 100 years I study. And historians of the Renaissance have found that this period, that would be the Renaissance, is when the idea of there's an East and there's a West really starts to take shape in the European mentality, in the European mind. I have to agree with that scholarship. However, what my work is doing is showing that the boundaries between East and West remained porous. There is an East, there was a West, but there's gray. All right, and I'm studying the gray. All right. Second, the narrative of modern Western science these days begins with the Renaissance. Science and rationality are so important to the West's self-image. Older narratives do credit these translations from Arabic into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries for kind of rousing Europe from the kind of mythical torpor of the Middle Ages, like the kind you see in Monty Python movies. That's kind of a myth, but we have it. All right. So, and that's true. These translations helped. But what I'm kind of saying is the exchange, if that's the wake-up call, the exchange I found is the triple shot latte that came afterward. I'm forcing us kind of to re-examine the assumptions we make about ourselves, assumptions that we are often bring unknowingly to the study of the Middle East. So I think that's a broader contribution of this book. All right. Okay. The book, like the whole project started about 20 years ago with kind of a history of science problem. And so I just want to show a little bit about what that was. I'm going to show some slides with diagrams of astronomical models on them. Okay. I want to just give you a sense of the evidence. It could be new to you. It might be interesting to you, but I also recognize it might not be. We'll be through this in 2 minutes. And it's okay if you don't absorb anything. Your takeaways don't really matter. I just want to show you the evidence because I'm a professor. All right. So here's the deal. And you can look at me. There's a picture of me if you're like not into what's on the. All right. All right. For several decades, historians of science, like since my parents went to college, that's what I mean. Historians of science have been aware of multiple resemblances between the Earth-centered planetary theories of astronomers in late medieval Islamic societies, 14th century, and the sun-centered theories of Nicholas Copernicus, who died in 1473. The possibility, all right, so here you see like the lunar models, the models for the moon of both Ibn Shatir, who is a scholar in Damascus, and Nicholas Copernicus. You can see me going into Copernicus's house in today's Poland. They're identical. These are absolutely identical. Copernicus, as you may know, is famous for theorizing that the cosmos, like our solar, there's a solar system, basically. The cosmos is centered on the sun, right? And he did do that. What this figure is showing you are his models for 4 planets, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each circle here represents a component of the motion of a planet, which is either P, if you're Copernicus in the dashes, or Q, I think, if you're Ibn Shatir in the solid lines. The point is, every single circle in the solid lines maps on exactly in dimensions to a dashed circle, which means the mathematical or geometric components of the motions are identical. What Copernicus did was he moved some vectors around. So up there is a sun as an Earth-centered model, and here's a sun-centered. This is simplified, but you can see what the transformation, which is he's taking that parallelogram and sliding it down. That's all you need to know. That's all you need to put up with. The possibility that trans-regional exchange with Islamic societies mattered was first considered in the 50s. But then at the beginning of this millennium, the eminent general historian of astronomy, John North, concluded, and I quote, "It's hardly possible to doubt that Copernicus was aware of some text or another in which they, and that would be Islamic theories, were to be found." Merchants of Knowledge began as my attempt, actually, this is like, why look at this, as my attempt to answer the question of how Copernicus got this information. The information he needed for his first text of astronomy, which he wrote between 1508 and 14. It's a tough question because Copernicus didn't cite a single source that was composed within 200 years of his lifetime in any language, even in Latin. He never traveled to an Islamic society, nor did he read an Islamic language. So we still don't know with whom Copernicus spoke, but I finger a likely source in Merchants of Knowledge. That source and the other intermediaries are the Merchants of Knowledge. So who were they? They were a trans-regional network of Jewish scholars who knew each other and bridged the Ottoman Empire, Crete, and the Veneto. So watch me not finding Ottoman Empire. Oh yeah, it's right here. It's kind of like here. That's Constantinople or Istanbul. This is Crete, sometimes also known as Candia, after its major city, Candia, which is today's Heraklion. If you've been watching Chaos, the series, which is pretty good. And then Venice, you can see my jumping ability. I kept me out of the NBA. It's up there. Is up there. The Venetian Republic is a republic centered on Venice. It's important to know that Crete was part of the Venetian Republic at the time. All of the merchants of knowledge were connected to Candia on Crete, even if some hailed from elsewhere. How did I kind of define who they were? They all owned manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts, that were sold on Crete to the agents of a guy named Ulrich Fugger. I think he's up there. Between 1539 and 41. The Fuggers were, if you're in the business, they were a well-known merchant scholar family in Europe. If you know the word pettifoggery, that comes from Fugger, like getting really into money. Yeah, it comes from them. So they were merchants, but they were also really interested in scholarship and bought and set up libraries. Their collection is the core of the Vatican Library's Hebrew collection. Like these were real players in sort of academia. All right. Anyway, and they sold them to the agents. The merchants of knowledge owned the manuscripts that were sold to the Fuggers agents. The merchants of knowledge were interested in many fields: philosophy, medicine, astrology, astronomy, mechanics, and the occult sciences. Oh, yeah. In some cases, merchants of knowledge participated in commerce. In all cases, the commercial activities of the families of the merchants of knowledge depended on socially and geographically wide-ranging contacts. And that these contacts facilitated intellectual exchange. If you're working in this time, right, around 1500, it's really hard generally to find out much about scholars. You often have what they wrote, but you don't know much else. The great thing about these merchants of knowledge is that they're connected to families who traveled all over the place and talked to all sorts of people. So when you keep that in mind, it's easy to see how, like, the few recorded instances of a merchant of knowledge talking to they're Jewish, the merchants, talking to a Christian or a Muslim has a broader context. Everyone else in their family was, why wouldn't these guys? Right. Multiple members of the merchants of the merchant scholar families, like the families of the merchants of knowledge. Am I still loud enough? Oh, yeah. Okay, great. All right, thanks. Good. Were mentioned in the records of the Venetian notary and the Venetian ducal court. These records show that books and manuscripts, which are the material for intellectual exchange, were also objects of purchase and sale. And so since commerce was like the scaffolding for intellectual exchange, and because the sale of books and the ability to translate redounded to scholars' commercial advantage, the most important scholars in these families were, in a direct sense, merchants of knowledge. But the book's title is also a metaphor, because by labeling the most important scholars from these families, merchants of knowledge, I couch intellectual exchange in terms of the scholars' own prerogatives, in terms of their own agendas, whether it's intellectual growth or the accumulation of social capital, or both, not in terms of any agenda of Renaissance humanism or any telos of the history of science. By that, I mean, I heard start off by talking about Copernicus and like, what would our world be like if he never lived, right? Like, what would we be without the scientific revolution? Right, think about that. But see, the thing is, like, the merchants of knowledge had no idea, right? And they had their own reasons for doing what they were doing, and it wasn't to create modernity. And so thinking about the words show you that all of this stuff was transactional. Exchange could be transactional, but the kind of epistemological or scholarly commitments of the merchants of knowledge and their contacts would be the market. Like, what sells? Well, it depends what people were into. So the first of my major findings is that not only have I identified the merchants of knowledge, but I've also collected the receipts for their transactions. The initial statements by historians of astronomy about the connections between Renaissance and astronomy and late medieval Islamic astronomy were based on similarities, based on looking at the diagrams and the texts, particularly with the models of the theories of this guy, Ibn Shatir. But the identity of the intermediary or intermediaries was unavailable. Only in the aughts, the first what would that be, decade of the 21st century, did my colleague Svi Langerman report that Moses Galeano, also known as Musa Jalinus, who died after 1542, he's the most significant merchant of knowledge. He knew of the theories of Ibn Shatir, like all that astronomy I already showed you. And Galeano or Jalinus was in Venice around 1500, which was a good time to be there if you're trying to explain Renaissance science. That was a big deal. And then I uncovered unprecedented granular evidence of Galeano or Jalinus's contact with Christian scholars. For example, he owned two of the manuscripts that were sold to the Fuggers. He knew the details of another astronomical text that definitely ended up in Renaissance Italy. And Galeano Jalinus's own account of that astronomical text actually ends up in the Sultan's personal library. That would be the Ottoman Sultan's personal library, which is pretty interesting to me. And he brought knowledge of European medicine to readers of Islamic languages. So he's bringing stuff back. It's not a one-way download for the Europeans. It's bi or multi-directional. There's more. But the point is that there are now many documented instances of intellectual exchange between Galeano Jalinus, the other merchants of knowledge, and their Muslim and Christian contacts. For example, let's take another one. Another merchant of knowledge, this guy, Moses Kohen Ashkenazi. Galeano Jalinus owned the only extant manuscript of Kohen Ashkenazi's Summa, like big ass, frankly, text on astrology called Urim V'Tumim, which is the motto of Yale University. So, and it's an allusion to a divinatory tool that the high priests of the Jewish temple way back in the day used, apparently. Anyway, this manuscript was among those that were sold to the Fuggers agents. To just pause, to get the world of the merchants of knowledge, you have to take astrology seriously for 20 minutes. Astrology doesn't have necessarily widespread credibility today, but back at their time, it was kind of like the pre-modern economics. It was a science that could be used to talk about anything. Was it criticized in the day? Yeah. Are economists criticized? Sure. And what would you do without them, right? Same thing with astrology. Kohen Ashkenazi cited in Urim V'Tumim several informants he labeled as Turkish speaking. By comparing and contrasting material attributed to the Turkish speakers and 15th century Ottoman astrological texts, I was able to show that these references pan out. It's information that could only come from Turkish texts. It didn't come from his Hebrew sources. So he's talking to Ottoman scholars. Then the Fuggers buy it. Why would Christian scholars be interested in Urim V'Tumim? Because Kohen Ashkenazi presented astrology more as a religious philosophy and less as a method of forecasting to game the system. Was he talking about forecasting? Yes, but he was kind of saying by forecasting, you have a better knowledge of your own reality. And if you know your own reality better, you're going to be able to make better moral choices. This approach, I argue at length, would have helped Renaissance European scholars grapple with a major critique of astrology written by a really well-known Renaissance scholar, Pico della Mirandola. That's him. And he wrote that in around 1492. And this was like a bombshell in the European astrology world, but Cohen Ashkenazi is kind of like giving you a way past it. So there would have been a market for this manuscript if you're into astrology. Pico was actually a student of Elijah del Medico, who died in 1497, who's really the best known scholar among the merchants of knowledge. Elijah, after losing Elijah, after losing Pico as a student, taught other influential Italians, such as Domenico Grimani, who became a cardinal, a bishop, Antonio Pizzamano, among others. Del Medico also edited Latin texts that were then printed, and he also composed Hebrew version of works that he wrote in Latin for his Jewish readers. And so Elijah made money from being multilingual. His son did too. We know from the Venetian archives that Elijah's son Moses Domenico benefited in business from his or someone else's ability to translate. So, for example, in 1502, I read that a Venetian notary noted the receipt of 50 gold ducats from Moses del Medico. The notary says that he received the payment in 1500 and then returned to Moses another 10 ducats that he was owed. Now, from a marginal notation in the archives, I read that a letter of exchange, which was a way to draw on deposits in a distant bank for the sum, that would be the 50 gold ducats, was sent from Constantinople and remitted in Candia. So, and the whole description of this letter is in Latin. So either Moses del Medico wrote the letter in Latin, or he wrote it in Hebrew, which was the literary language of the Jews of the Byzantine Empire and the Venetian Republic, and that letter was translated for the Venetians. And so translation matters in commerce, and it mattered in scholarship. On the left here is a type of document called a chirograph. And you can read in the archives about how the merchant scholar families used chirographs to settle, for example, claims on estates of the deceased. So what they are, this is one from England, which I got from Wikipedia. It's not in my project. But it's a document written out in triplicate, and then it's cut on wavy lines in an idiosyncratic way, and you can re-authenticate it, or you can authenticate it by putting it back together, right? Okay, and there are translations of chirographs in the Venetian archives. So the commerce like their financial lives of commerce depend on translation, just like scholarship. These are just a few of the commercial and intellectual contacts between the merchants of knowledge, their families, and Christians and Muslims. So I defined the merchants of knowledge as those who sold manuscripts to the Fuggers. Merchants of knowledge is my term. It's not like they didn't call themselves that or anything. But by defining the network that way, I was able to systematize what would be in any other sense, a bunch of anecdotes. But by showing how they were all connected and knew each other, it's a way to make sense of a ton of data and show there's actually something going on here, that there was a network. My second principal finding, so I already was talking about the receipts, I did already a bit about the intellectual world, the importance of astrology, right? But that really kind of flows into my second principal finding, which is the intellectual worlds of their scholars and the contexts. There was relevant exchange in multiple fields, not all of which are featured in dominant narratives of scientific progress. Like, you can't get this if you don't just accept for the time you're reading the book or 15 more minutes now, the importance of, say, astrology or Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, or pre-modern medicine. I mean, they were into all sorts of stuff that doesn't really matter to many people, but you don't see, if you don't see how it, if you don't appreciate everything, you don't really get the whole market for the knowledge. Okay. So the key is then that the threads of trans-regional conversations in a variety of disciplines intertwined, and that the intellectual priorities of the merchants of knowledge are not modern intellectual priorities. Matters of astrology impinged on philosophy, Kabbalah, and theoretical astronomy. The scholars I write about were involved in many disciplines, and exchange flowed in multiple directions. The merchants of knowledge were interested in texts written in Latin, even though supposedly Europe is just waking up. That's not really true, right? And the Jews were interested in Latin because Latin knowledge for Latin texts contributed to Jewish intellectual life at the time. That's pretty well known. That's why erudite Jewish scholars would have sought out Christians. But another reason is because Latin texts and their contents were in demand at the Ottoman court, which to a lot of people would be counterintuitive, but I'll show you in a bit. It's not quite in this paragraph. But then the merchants of knowledge were also sought after by Christians because they knew about Kabbalah, and Christians were really interested in Kabbalah. Mondano is not the first Christian to be into Kabbalah, right? All sorts of Christians were into it. It can really work if it's a great, in a way, it's kind of a good argument. I'm Jewish, but it's a good argument for Christianity. Sorry. And because Jews were competent in combinations of Arabic, Hebrew, Turkish, and Latin, they had these skills enabled them to market their knowledge in ways that advanced their own aims. Okay. All right. So what are some of the things, how does this all play out? So for one thing, many of the merchants of knowledge and their Christian contacts were often radical followers of Aristotle, known as Averroists. And one interesting thing that Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, he died in 1198, he said that there's a single human intellect. Anybody watching Pluribus? Yeah, okay, I'm loving it because that's basically the deal. There's a hive mind because all smart people know the same things. Like 2 + 2 is 4. And do you see what rational truth is rational truth. So we all know the same truths. Therefore, as you learn, you're actually kind of connecting to an intellect that's up in the cloud. That's pretty far out. There are some real problems with that, but that's what Averroes believed. This is you see how far out this is? They also had their own type of astronomy, though. And Averroist astronomy has been blown off because it's far out. But I was looking at this, and here's a diagram of the model for the moon from a Averroist astronomy text on the right. And it's like an Averroist version. I mean, other people have backed me up on this in print. It's an Averroist version of the Copernicus Ibn Ashad lunar model. So the point is, and we know this Averroist text does end up in Renaissance Italy. So by looking at weird stuff, you can actually start to see how it was how exchange was really happening. Now let's get to the Latin texts. Here's an example. Soon after, Galiano Gellinus returned to Istanbul from Venice by 1503, and that would presumably have been where he shared theoretical astronomy. He authored a text on pharmacology in Ottoman Turkish. He dedicated it to the Sultan's chief physician, Ahi Çelebi. Galiano, or Gellinus, when he's really Gellinus because he was writing in Turkish, wrote in order to intervene in a debate about compound medicine. So what's that? Basically, there were what would these be? Simple medicines, like an herb, for example, or a powder. That would be one thing, like honey, right? And all these simple medicines, or a laxative, or an emetic, or something. And these things have kind of properties. They're hot or cold to various degrees. Okay. The debate about, though, is how to calculate the overall properties of a medicine that's been compounded from simple drugs. And that there was a debate. Muslims started it. One guy, Al-Kindi, who was a 9th century physician, said that something hot in the 4th degree was 8 times as hot as something in the 1st degree, or 16 times as hot as a simple medicine without heat. That's problematic for reasons we don't need to get into. Ibn Rushd or Averroes wrote back or responds that no, something hot in the 4th degree was 4 times as hot as something in the 1st degree, which is, it's just like, this is why these things won't kill you, right? Okay. But Galliano Gellinus doesn't like that either. And he starts borrowing ideas from physicians who wrote in Latin. One he cites is Arnaldo de Villanova and Bernard de Gordon. And these are 14th century guys. And both of them said that 1 unit of medicine that's hot or cold or whatever in the 4th degree is equivalent to 1.5 units of medicine hot in the 3rd degree and to 2 units of medicine hot in the 2nd degree or whatever. So Arnaldo's got his own ideas. So what's so interesting is that Galliano Gellinus is slotting Latin European physicians into a debate that had started in Arabic texts. And he's saying, hey, Ottomans, I know this stuff. You don't. So patronize me, which basically means fund me. All right. So he was an outsider. And he found a place at the Sultan's court by bringing knowledge that was harder to come by. And here's another example. This is an Arabic translation, and he's writing here as Musa Gellinus again, of an astronomy text called the Almanach Perpetuum. It's an astronomy text, but it's really good for astrology. That's really why you'd want to read this. And it's actually an astronomy text that was created in Latin, but drew heavily on Hebrew sources. And so he's like, I bet a high-ranking Ottoman judge, Abdurrahman Muayyadzadeh, would really want to know this stuff. And that checks out. Like Abdurrahman Muayyadzadeh was a bibliophile. He studied all sorts of things. Makes total sense based on what others have found out about him, that he'd be into astronomy. And like, Galliano's like, here, I got this for you. So he translates a Latin astronomy text into Arabic at a time when people were like, why would anyone do this? My doctoral advisors and people were like, no, obviously, because Islam is so awesome, which is great. I like that. But that it's just a one-way proposition. It's actually bidirectional. Right. Okay. Translation, a competency that Galliano Gellinus honed in scholarship, also fueled his non-academic ambition. So we've seen that before with the Delmeticos. It's true with Galliano. In 1529, we read in the archives, soon after he gets to Candia on Crete from the Ottoman Empire, he translated a letter addressed to the Venetian rulers written in Turkish and Arabic script. So I'm going to, maybe if I'm looking out the crowd, I cannot say this to my students. Anybody see Welcome Back, Kotter? All right. So he's like Arnold Horshack. He's like, ooh, call on me. I can do it. I'm smarter than everyone else. Right. And it works for him. All right. This is the last example of exchange I want to talk about in my presentation. It's about a transregional mechanical device that embodied the fungibility of languages. So here's what happened. Galliano Gellinus reported that when he was at the Sultan's court, there's a guy there he's the master of mechanical devices. In this case, Galliano Gellinus was writing in Hebrew. So all we have is the Hebrew term. I don't know what it would have been in. I mean, I could guess, but you don't really know what it is in Turkish. And that guy was able to recount a long list of names without writing anything down. And Galliano's like, how did you do that? I want to know. He yearned to uncover how everybody was fooled, but the technology was too complex and it was beyond his mastery until he traveled to Venice, which a trip I've already talked about, and where he observed the same feats of memory being performed. So the device is trans-regional, just like Galeano and just like some texts. Then he's like, I think I got this. I think I know how it works. And so this is how he thought it worked. All right, the first thing, let's start with vowels. And if you do know any Middle Eastern languages, this account of the vowels isn't really true. But it doesn't matter because it's what he thought, right? And we're trying to see how his brain works. So across here it says Greek and Romance, and you could sort of maybe make out like the A-E-I-O-U. Do you see that? And this manuscript is likely in his own handwriting, which I think is pretty cool. And then here's the Hebrew vowels. You see U, O, E, A, and A. There are actually more vowels than that in Hebrew. I think that's been so weird. Then here are the Arabic vowels, and this is like an U pronounced as an O. Like if you studied Arabic, like this guy's kind of fudging it a little. Here's an E, here's an A, but really this is an in. Like again, he's kind of making it up a little, and that's an A. So he's saying 3 languages have the same vowel systems. Then what he does is he assigns each Hebrew vowel he assigns each vowel a numerical value based on the dominant vowel in the Turkish numbers. All right, so the Turkish word for one is beer. And what Galeano's saying is that you hear a b, and you sort of hear a there, right? And Hebrew has a vowel called a schwa. Like if there's an English word schwa, if you're into linguistics, and it's kind of a silent vowel. It's like it's a light, almost silent vowel. And so the schwa in Hebrew is a 1. Iki is how you say 2 in Turkish, and you're hearing a lot of E in iki. So E has a 2, is represented by 2. Üç, 3, is the U sound. So that gets it. Do you see, like, so U is 3. Dirt, 4 in Turkish, has an O in there. So he's like, so O is 4. Besh, 5, has an A in his opinion. And so A is 5. Alta, 6, has an A in there. It does. And so the A sound is 6. All right. What this all tells you is that there's not only an underlying similarity of the languages in this ambit, there's some type of underlying mathematical reality, which I go into a little more in the book, but we want to wind up soon. But that's an interesting thing to think about. He thinks that this device will work for other languages besides Hebrew, although he doesn't explain. All right, but there are also consonants, and we've only done the vowels. So what's up with the consonants? Here's a diagram of the device. So basically, imagine a disc, right? That's kind of where you're cutting maybe of wood, and they're kind of notches cut in, perhaps, so that you could feel in your pocket, like if you have it in the pocket of your cloak, you could feel the notches. Do you see what I mean? And like know where each spoke is. There are 22 consonants in the Hebrew alphabet, and there are 12 spokes on this wheel. And so there's a little repetition, but he's basically saying there's an analogy between the 12 spokes of the wheel and the 12 zodiacal signs. Remember, it's all about astrology. All right. He's interested in the alphanumeric values of Hebrew letters. I have a little alphanumeric chart there if you're into that, because again, he thinks there's an underlying mathematical reality to all letters. How does this work? There are generally 2 Hebrew consonants on each spoke. Okay. There's a string coming out from the center, or a thread. If you want to transcribe the consonant that's higher in the Hebrew alphabet, then you thread the You thread the thread through the peg. Sorry, I forgot to say there are pegs for each consonant. You thread the thread through the pegs. If you want to transcribe the consonant that's lower in the alphabet, you go around both pegs. Then you twist the thread around the peg or pegs the number of times that corresponds with the vowel. So now you've transcribed the consonant and the vowel that goes with it. Letter one. All right. Presumably the thread's going to have to be pretty long so you can take down multiple names. I don't know, but that's like don't look at me. That's how this works. Right. There are, if you're skeptical, cool. It's okay to be skeptical. He goes on. I've cut this out of my presentation because I know we want to move to Q&A. He talks about other uses for this device, and some of the other uses I'm pretty convinced won't work. So in a way, I do think this can work, but some of the other stuff he says is definitely not going to work. So ultimately, what's to me the takeaway is that he believes in the mathematical unity of all languages. We know, for example, at the Ottoman court, not only was astrology a big deal, but so was another type of divination called lettrism, al-haruf. And they were really in competition. Like the lettrist people were really not into astrology. Like, you might think it's all right, but actually there was competition between divination and, letter divination and astrology. So I think this idea of the mathematical unity of language really coheres with its lettrist forecasting in the Ottoman Empire. Let's conclude. The connections engendered by the merchants of knowledge have become as worthy of study as the entities they connect. Without understanding their own intellectual production, in which material from Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, and Turkish texts was hybridized in various proportions, we would not fully grasp how this exchange occurred. You can't just focus on astronomy. It's obvious that the merchants of knowledge's linguistic abilities enabled them to traverse and puncture disciplinary and geographic boundaries and to create their own distinctive culture. By exposing this wide-ranging intellectual and commercial exchange, I rebut the proposition or the presumption of a clean division between the intellectual life of Renaissance Europe and that of Islamic societies. And that's a corollary of the idée fixe that the Renaissance marked the autochthonous birth of modern Europe. It's not true. I think there was a Renaissance. It's a much more complex, it's a much more multicultural and diverse Renaissance than we used to think. The merchants of knowledge belonged to families that were heavily taxed, and they lacked the citizenship status of their Muslim and Christian contacts. The merchants of knowledge were not allowed to dwell permanently in the metropole. Galliano, for example, could get to Venice only because he's a physician. He's not allowed to stay there because he's Jewish. But despite their peripheral political status of the merchants of knowledge, European Renaissance and Ottoman intellectual history in the late 15th and early 16th centuries can't be fully understood apart from the contacts they facilitated and the intellectual world that they created. And finally, my work, I hope, is a reminder that everything that happened was contingent. It didn't have to happen. Thanks. Into Q&A, yeah.
Earlier in your talk, you were often using the word astrology and astronomy, and I wasn't really picking on that.
Yeah.
How do those two relate?
Right. Well, they're related. Yeah. So it's a good question. In the first couple of centuries of Islam, like what we might think of as astrology and what we think of as astronomy were the same discipline. Astrological forecast was kind of an application of astronomy. So yeah, they're very close. Because astrology was such a big deal, that's a huge motivation to produce up-to-date tables and accurate tables of planetary positions so you can forecast. it's a reason, not the only reason. It's not the only reason at all, but it's a reason to build an observatory. It's a reason to acquire instruments, which were very expensive. So there's certainly a distinction between them. And as Islam goes on, by the 11th century, they're beginning astrological forecasting and astronomy become separate, but there's still astrology because you can't live without it. It's important. I mean, I didn't get to this, but it's important, for example, for disease etiology, like influenza, right? Like the celestial influences make you sick. I mean, they don't, but that's what the word comes from. Yeah. Please.
Is there a decline in tolerance in Turkey that influenced Jewish scholars and merchants in the late 16th century with move to Europe, to Venice?
Could you repeat the question?
Was there a decline in tolerance in Turkey that eventually Jewish merchants moved to Europe, moved west, you want to call it?
So Jews are mobile for sure. There's no doubt about it. I mean, like Jews are, one reason they're interesting to study is because they've been forced to move around so much. And a result is trans-regional networks and connections. Right. And merchants would take advantage of this. That said, I'm not aware of persecution of Jews in the Ottoman Empire at that time. And so with I'm pretty no. The story I'm telling is from before you. But the answer to your question is no. What's interesting is the worlds of the merchants of knowledge is actually affected and effected by the successive expulsion of Jews from Iberia, and that kind of, as I say, is like kind of flushes the toilet bowl or stirs the toilet bowl of the Mediterranean, and and Jews are going to the Italian peninsula, and then they're going famously to the Ottoman Empire. And that movement affects them. The merchants of knowledge weren't coming from Spain or Iberia, but that really affected them. So it's persecution elsewhere, actually, that created some of the interesting movement. Yeah, please.
So fast forward 500 years to February 2026, Camden Conference.
Not there.
What are the speakers make of it? What is this? How is this relevant or connect the dots to the discussion that may happen in 2 or 3 months?
I can't predict that. But why is it? Why should you have listened to this? Well, thanks. Why? No. So, I think so. So on one hand, it shows that this is a slightly different world, right? It's a world before nation states. It's a world, obviously, before the modern middle, it's before colonialism, it's before post-colonialism. And I think learning about this world is helpful, I think, for modern Middle East scholars, because it shows you that a different way is possible. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I don't think it would have been particularly fun to be Moses Galliano or anything, but it just shows that the world we're in is not the only way things have been. I think there's a real, I don't believe your speakers think this, but I couldn't imagine, but I could imagine, it's normal to think that what makes the West so great? We're rational, we're scientific, we're rich. Your mileage may vary, but this is part of a stock Western self-image. And I think, it's easy to bring that to your study of something else. To think, the Islamic countries are often thought of as irrational, bereft of technology, bereft of science. And I think this work, I'm not saying you think this, but I think this is helpful to keep in mind, that shows it wasn't like that. It doesn't have to be like that. Everything's contingent. Yeah. I'm happy to keep talking, but maybe take some more questions. Yeah, please.
But I sort of am interpreting that one of the points you're making is sort of the monetized exchange of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to think about how that still exists today.
Totally.
And that there
Yeah.
surely is and must be examples in today as the West, and I'm going to be very specific and say the United States would relate to the Middle East, and I'm thinking of the Arab Emirates or something like that. So I'm just trying to apply what you're saying, which is very fascinating to me, to today.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about money, in some ways, right? Like, look, I mean, I'm a professional scholar, right? Like, I really like what I do, but I kind of need, right? I mean, I need help. I have a family. That's a correspondence. At the same time, they weren't purely it's merchants of knowledge, not mercenaries of knowledge, right? Like Elijah Del Medico, for example, right? He was a teacher of Pico della Mirandola, who's like a famous Renaissance scholar, right? Okay, I mean, maybe, okay. But why did Pico dump him? Because Pico was really into Kabbalah, and Jews invented Kabbalah, and and Elijah Del Medico is interested in it and bought it up to a point, but he was uncomfortable with Pico's interpretation and use of Kabbalah, and he's like, I'm done. He wouldn't go any further. I mean, it's a more nuanced breakup I talk about in the book, but that's a lot of it. Like Elijah Del Medico was just like, I'm not comfortable teaching this. So he had his red lines. Like money and prestige weren't everything. I mean, of course, if you're Elijah Del Medico,
like you, Catherine, he was making.
Try me. No, but like, right. No, I'd like to think that. Yeah. I mean, he's also so famous. Like he landed pretty softly. Like he got other wealthy students. But yeah.
How did they acquire the texts, the sources that they went to actually access and acquire the texts
that they sell?
They bought and sold.
Yeah, it depends. Sometimes, I mean, really, it depends which text you're talking about. I mean, sometimes it's their own copies. And sometimes these are older manuscripts that have already a chain of buyers and sellers and then the Jews on Crete get it. And there's no one size fits all answer. And the other thing is that some of the manuscripts that are bought and sold are what are known as codices. That means they're kind of compendia of shorter texts, and the individual parts in the codex are in different hands, which means that the codex was assembled. That just complicates it further.
And clearly, there were other people who knew they had something of value. That somebody wanted to.
Right. They were. I mean, maybe like this could be. Crete was a well-known scholarly destination at the time. There were, and it wasn't just for Hebrew texts. There were Renaissance humanists were going to Crete from the Italian peninsula, thinking they could get Greek manuscripts to print, to typeset and print. Yeah, and so there's a lot of traffic at the time. Yeah. Please.
How does Gutenberg fit into all this?
Well, I mean, he's not in this, but what
before is this before?
No, Gutenberg is like 1450s. Yeah. So no, this is after Gutenberg. As an aside, one thing that's interesting is printing doesn't take off in the Ottoman Empire nearly as quickly as it does in Europe. I don't know what to tell you about that, but it's a fact. Printing is big for this story, though, because Elijah Del Medico's editions of philosophy texts, as well as his own independent Latin compositions, get printed, and then they're diffused. And so this is like, to your question, I was talking about with manuscripts, you only know like who's reading, like the owners, like you could be pretty, but once a book gets printed, I mean, it's all over the place, right? And so this is a big, this kind of made Elijah a big name, and you can then infer a lot about his reach and how important his ideas were. So printing really helped this whole thing happen. Yeah, printing's also big. I mean, if you're into Copernican studies, printing's a big deal for this guy Regiomontanus, who was like the most famous astronomer in Renaissance Europe until Copernicus, like, which is why you may not have heard of him, right? But he was also a famous printer, and produced scholarly editions of, say, the Ptolemy's Almagest. So printing mattered for understanding. Printing matters if you want to learn more about Copernicus too. Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Did these networks of the merchants of knowledge sort of, what happened in the next 100 years, basically? Yeah. So I quit after 50 pages. So what? So I defined the network by the people who sold the manuscript to the Fuggers, and ultimately they died. Is one thing, right? Like, or Galeano Gellinas, for example, leaves the island, and like sometime after 1542, because they get taxed. He gets taxed so much, you can track by who's on the island, by who's on Crete, by who's paying, right? And so 1542 is the last time he pays, so he's off. And there's a notation that in there that he's going to Tripoli. And it's hard to know which Tripoli, probably thinking the one in Lebanon, but yeah. But yeah, they died. And I kind of, in some ways it's artificial, but I don't like writing more than 350 pages because it's just like, let's end this, people. Like, have you ever read an academic book and you get to page 300, you're like, give me more? I mean, really? Like, it's my job, and I'm like, I'm done. I get them for free. It's like, I don't care. I'm pretty done most of the time. And so I'm serious. Like, pacing is important, and you want to have a narrative. You want this to end. So that's because it's an analytic term. Do you see what I mean? It's something I'm using to impose order on data. But did the networks of these families?
Like the Delmeticos remain a very influential family. They're, for example, they are pretty big. The Balbos, who I didn't talk about in this, but they're big. Another family is the Capsalis. I can say only so much in the presentation. They're still around, and there's more exchange going on. It doesn't mean exchange ends. It doesn't mean Jews are the only people doing exchange. Not at all. I mean, for example, you could my doctoral advisor did a long study on Maronite Christians. So these are Lebanese Christians who Maronites, it's a dominant sect in Lebanon, they're in communion with Rome. And so some Lebanese Maronite Christians, for example, are the early catalogers of Arabic manuscripts at the Vatican. So there are other networks for sure. I'm just kind of calling this time. Yeah.
I may have misunderstood. In the very beginning, you said that I think in relation to the Fuggers, that attaining or sort of collecting manuscripts, that one was able to get information, but also social.
Oh yeah.
Important.
Mm-hmm.
Who was it? The Fuggers? Was it?
Yeah.
And then, if it was socially, social shift.
Yeah.
Or what? Because you could trade on the information, or just I'm rich and look at my library.
Both. Yeah.
The Fuggers they're not socially.
Oh, you're asking great. That's a great question. So I've been asked, people, hey, Robert, how come the Fuggers aren't merchants of knowledge? Right? Like, no, fair. It's totally fair. I just made that term to describe these Jews. However, if you're thinking about that term more generically, the Fuggers are totally merchants of knowledge. They don't need the money, but they want the prestige.
But they never get it, right?
Oh yeah, they do. Oh yeah, they do. They do.
if you dig into a little bit of the weeds of like 60. No, but like there's a Fugger library.
But you know,
That's pretty good.
yeah.
I mean, like Andrew Carnegie, like, Carnegie's founded all these libraries. Like he was he was an all kind of, but like he also did a lot of good things. I mean, it's not that different. Yeah.
I'm just using a modern
Yeah.
definition
Yeah.
of social.
Yeah. The merchants of knowledge definitely want the prestige so they can get tapped for an assignment. Right. But even very wealthy people like the Fuggers want the prestige too. Oh yeah. Right. And they're also I'm really kind of loath to say they're just collecting. I mean, I think they're reading because we know that they had like other Jews were their tutors, and they made like teams of manuscript copyists. I mean, like they were interested in what Hebrew manuscripts had to say. Yeah. No, thanks for that. Like, because you're right, they too are merchants.
Then you get those with the knowledge. It's still true today. If you have the knowledge, you have the power.
No, yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. Please.
This is just a very basic question. What was of most importance, or what were they writing about?
What's like the most important thing?
Yeah.
What's the hot topic? What's the hot topic was I would say like astrology. Yeah, astrology is big. Oh, sorry, you've heard about that. The other, yeah, like chapter 2. Yeah, so I was advised at one read stage, like to make it less cerebral, go with astrology, go with instruments because they're material, So there's that. I think the other big access, however, would be Averroist philosophy. Averroist, that's a radical Aristotelian philosophy. Those are the people who believe there's one intellect. Yeah, that was also a very widely shared perspective among the merchants of knowledge and their clients. Yeah, those are the two hot things. Medicine is another one. Yeah, medicine's a big deal. Like the Jews, a lot of Jews, including the emigres from Iberia, were physicians. And so there's this whole like dynamic at the Ottoman court where like the Sephardic Jews coming from Spain are coming in and they're all like sexy and hot. And then there are the Jews who are already in Asia Minor, like say Galliano, and he's constantly calling them the Sephardic Jews charlatans and quacks and debunking their cures. Yeah, so medicine is definitely a big, I mean, because we all have bodies and we all get, yeah. Please.
I do naive. Is it possible that some of the merchants of knowledge really wanted the knowledge shared out there? And as an aside, yeah, they made a living, but they wanted the knowledge. They wanted it to cross them, right?
Yeah.
Some of them must have had some kind of motivation that was, I know something really important and I'm going to let you.
I think there's some of that. So for example, when you look at, I was new to thinking about networks because but when other scholars who have worked on networks talk about open and closed networks, and sometimes in some networks, it's a closed network. And the example would be like Armenian merchant networks in the 17th century, right? Which are all over the Middle East. They don't tell anything to anyone who's not an Armenian merchant because that's their special sauce. Right. If we start sharing our commercial knowledge, we're losing our edge. The merchants of knowledge, as you're kind of suggesting, it wasn't a closed network. They didn't self-identify as merchants of knowledge. Again, it's just my term to impose order and chaos. And I agree in that respect, they would share. They probably wanted the most bang for their buck. But there is something about that. And sometimes not everyone, when they share, has totally pure motivation. Sometimes it's egotistical, like, look how smart I am. I mean, right. Yeah. I mean, at Galliano for sure. But if you compare it to a closed network, you got a point. Yeah.
To what extent in the period that you studied were images being transferred?
Do you mean like
Pictures.
paintings? Yeah, they're not within the net, like I didn't see it in the network. I mean, there are images like, there are diagrams like that. There are astronomical diagrams. Sometimes there are like charts of medications in the Ottoman medical text. However, like there's a famous portrait of Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror by Gentile Bellini, right? And so, I mean, sound like you've heard of, yeah. And so there is exchange of objects and potential, images aren't, there's no clear distaste for images, and other sort of artistic and kind of art objects were being exchanged, just not by the merchants of knowledge. Yeah. I mean, the whole idea that Muslims aren't into images, it's like, yeah, it's pretty debatable. Yeah. Anything else I can do for you? Yeah. Please.
What is the Kabul cable?
Kabbalah. What?
Wow, what is it?
Kabbalah. Oh God. Yeah.
It's controversial.
Oh, I mean, it's Kabbalah I mean, for one thing, it's hard to define, but broadly speaking, because there's more than one way to talk about it. Broadly speaking, it's Jewish mysticism. And what gets complicated, here's where it gets complicated, is that Kabbalists often, but not always, often talk about a system of 12 things. No, 10, right? 10. Sorry, I'm just getting tired here. 10. Like 10 things that could be emanations. And you could think of them as numbers. You could think of them as ways to interpret. If you see a chart of them, it looks like a man with a penis, and that's not unintentional. Where it gets controversial is that some Kabbalists believe that these emanations are called sphirot, are hypostases, that is self-subsisting. And when you say that, two things are now in play. One, that what people do affect God, because all these 10 sphirot are somehow connected to God. But what it means is that our actions can affect God, which can be really empowering, but well, that sounds kind of Christian. Let's see, we have self-subsisting emanations of God, right? And our actions affect God. Jesus died for our sins. Do you see? That's the controversy. Yeah. There are ways, I mean, you aren't tracked into that reasoning, but that's why Elijah Del Medico got the heebie-jeebies. Yeah. Yeah. So to speak. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.